We ended the last video with adding the yeast, so stop back by today to finish up with the entire process so that you'll see everything from the beginning stages in the first video on to the point in which we get to sit down after doing all your homesteading chores and enjoying a cold one. Hello world! Thanks for joining me today. It's another hot day here in the great state of Texas. If you haven't seen my last video, we're here with my friend John here. He's been showing us how to brew beer on your homestead. Or home brewing.
I claim this is my homestead actually in the tax valuation.
That's right,
so,
exactly.
This is my homestead.
Exactly. A little bit of sustainable living here. We ended the last video with adding the yeast to the
the carboy.
The carboy, which
the
is
wort
this glass bottle here.
Yep.
And the wort is the
sweet, sugary beer concoction that is ready to be eaten up by the yeast. So that's what's going on now.
Awesome. So stop back by today to finish up with the entire process so that you'll see everything from the beginning stages in the first video on to the point in which we get to sit down after doing all your homesteading chores and gathering your harvest from the garden and enjoying a cold one.
That's
so,
right.
So John, tell us where should we start today?
All right, well, Mickey, let's just start with where we left off, which was we had some yeast and we had some sweet and warm wort, which is our boiled concoction of malted barley and hops. And we had cooled that down to under 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and we had a yeast starter prepared. That was a Bavarian lager yeast, and we put it in there, and now within 6 to 12 hours, that yeast started to eat all that sugar and ferment this 5-gallon tank.
Why 90 degrees? Why was that important?
Well, it needs to be less than 90 so you don't shock or kill the yeast. This yeast is happiest at about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of yeasts that I use are room temperature yeast because it's not that easy to ferment at lager temperatures at 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But for example, a Belgian yeast strain or a typical American IPA yeast strain are ones that I've saved from previous batches, and they're very happy to ferment at 70 to 75 degrees or even warmer if necessary. But whatever temperature you ferment your yeast at is a very important factor in determining the flavor that yeast gives your beer. So that's a good, important thing to pay attention to if you can. So we've been fermenting at this one's about 55 degrees, but you can see slow bubbling out the top. Some activity. The yeast is just churning in there and creating a foam layer on top called the kreuzen, which is bubbles that are created by active fermentation. This will go on for 1 to 2 weeks, and at the point at which it's done, you'll see that foam cap sink back down into the beer, and it'll clear up at the top, and all the solids, or most of them, will settle out at the bottom. That's a point at which you're ready to do your first filtration step, which is to gravity filter or rack using just a tube and a cane. I have some rubber hose and a cane-shaped plastic tube. So what I'll do is I'll fill this up with clean water, and after sterilizing it, and I'll stick my cane into the carboy and hold the hose down below the level and create a gravity filtration or a gravity driven siphon into a second bucket which has already been sterilized. What I'll try to do is leave that layer of sediment on the bottom of this carboy. And I don't need that because it's mostly proteins and hop pellet particles and yeast. But what I will do is I'll save that bottom, it's called the yeast cake, and I'll wash it with some clean distilled water and rinse out the yeast from the other proteins and save a small jar of it like this to use in my next batch. So that's a way to more sustainably and more efficiently do your home brew. It's just like maintaining a sourdough yeast starter. I have several types of yeast I keep in my fridge on a regular basis, and it's a very easy thing to do.
Yeah, so you mentioned the siphoning process here, and there's a filter in this?
I've added a filter. I haven't found this that effective, honestly. But I would just stick with the straight hose if I was you. But really, it's a simple gravity filtration technique in which and I do this several times in my beer. I'll move it from one bucket to another and leave that settled sediment on the bottom. It helps you get a clearer beer. Two yeasts that do well fermenting at room temperatures in the 70s. A Belgian yeast called Ardennes yeast, which is a traditional Belgian like Abbey ale strain, but it's very versatile. I find make IPAs or brown ales or any variety of beers you can make with this yeast. And then this is it's called US05, but it's a type of yeast made by a company called Safali or Safe Ale, I guess. This is their classic American ale yeast strain. It's very common and easy to use. So put that in my next Sierra Nevada style IPA or any American ale would do well with that yeast strain.
How do you know when it's done?
Right. Well, if you have a glass carboy, you can see when the krausen falls back down and the fermentation is mostly done. A more scientific way, and the way industrial or microbrewers would do it, is to measure the specific gravity, Mickey. And that's I do that sometimes, but I brew more by feel than I do by science sometimes, which may not be the best advice every homebrewer's ever received or given, but it works for me. But you can measure the change in density of this liquid using a simple tool. It's called a hydrometer, and it's a floating floating gauge that measures the density of the liquid relative to water, which has a specific gravity of 1. And you see the density change as sugars, which are more dense, are converted into alcohols, which are less. And so the yeast does its job, and that specific gravity drops over a week to 2 weeks. And if you can measure that, and when you see it reach its final gravity and stay steady for several days, then you know it's done. But I just usually wait until it looks like the active fermentation has stopped, and then I rack it to a secondary fermenter, wait a few more days, and then either bottle or keg it, get ready to drink it.
And racking, as you said, is that process of using a siphoning to take it from one place to another.
Right. Which you also want to do carefully, using sanitized equipment, and while introducing as little oxygen to the beer as possible, because initially you want a lot because the yeast uses it, but once the fermentation is done, you don't want the beer to be exposed to oxygen, which will help some of its flavor components spoil or break down. So the freshest beer is the beer that has least oxygen after its fermentation was complete. But anyway, so this is chugging away. I'm gonna let it do that for another week or two. And this is a lager, so it has a special fermentation process, and after it's fermented at 50 degrees for 2 weeks, I'll drop the temperature down to about 32, and I'll let it sit for 6 more weeks or longer, and age or lager. So lagers are inherently more difficult to brew than ales because they require that those chilled temperatures and extended fermentation times, 17 to 20 degrees Celsius down to 0. So for you Australians,
awesome.
Yeah. right, Mickey, we're almost done here. We've brewed a beer. We've started fermenting it, the yeast, and now say a couple weeks has gone by in your brewing process, and you've been monitoring your beer. You can see that the yeast has stopped active fermentation. Your airlock is not bubbling anymore. Maybe if you're more detail-oriented than me, you've taken measurements with a hydrometer, and you've seen that the hydrometer has dropped in readings down to a consistent level, which is called your final gravity measurement. And after consistent readings for a few days, you're sure that your yeast is done fermenting. Now it's time to bottle or keg your beer, to package it for drinking. So there's two ways to do that, and for many years, 2 decades, I bottled my beer exclusively using, these are the easiest kind of bottles. I call them pop top bottles. Yeah. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, some big, some much smaller. They're a little bit hard to get your hands on sometimes, but then you can also just recycle or buy, but preferably just collect empties. And it's some trouble to scrape the stickers off sometimes, but you end up with 5 gallons of beer. Mickey makes about roughly 2 cases of beer, so 48 12-ounce beers plus maybe another 6-pack if you stretch it out a little bit. And so that's about the number of bottles you would need. And then if you're bottling like that, you also need caps, and these need to be sanitized just like the bottles before you put them in. You want to make sure that there's no gunk growing in there, and that they've been sanitized. I put them in the dishwasher usually with some bleach, and but you can also do it by hand. Sometimes if I have real gunky bottles, I need to submerge them in. That's what PBW is good for. You soak something in that for an hour or so, and it'll pull off any kind of gunk. Let's say we were going to bottle our beer. We knew it was done fermenting. Well, there's 2 things we need to do. We need to prime it, which is adding a little bit more sugar, and we need to bottle it. And the sugar we're going to add, Mickey, is I usually use corn sugar, which is I get from my homebrew supply shop. You could also use the same kind of dry malt extract that we use in brewing. There's a number of things. You could probably use table sugar for that matter, but it's important to know which type of sugar you're using and how much exactly you want to add to 5 gallons, because that is kind of that's how you calibrate your carbonation. You can add a little more or a little less and put it in the bottle, and your bottles might get so carbonated that they exploded, which is a common problem that some homebrewers have experienced. I've only had 1 bottle explode on me, but it does happen if you put a little too much sugar in there.
Yeah, I've had it where you pop the top and it just over foams.
It foams for 20 minutes, yeah. And alternately, if you don't put enough, then your bottles will never get as well carbonated as you would like. So there's a little bit of a exact science to that, but the general number I use is 3/4 of a cup, even 3/4 of a cup of corn sugar for a 5-gallon batch. And that works pretty well for me if I stick to it. So once I've added my priming sugar, which is just enough to wake that yeast up that's still in suspension in your beer, even though most of it is settled out by this point, you rack it to a bottling bucket, mix in your priming sugar, and fill your bottles. And I do it with this little hose and a bottle filler. Fill them up 1 bottle at a time, and you want to fill it up just to about 1 inch from the top. Let's get it up there, and now we're gonna cap them. And you can't recycle bottle caps, unfortunately, but you can get cheaply fresh unused caps. And a simple tool like this, which again is available from your homebrew supply, is a bottle capper. And there we have a bottle of beer. Now, if this is a freshly bottled beer, it's going to take around 2 weeks until the yeast has carbonated that bottle. Sometimes as little as a week. Sometimes it takes longer, 3 weeks or a month. It sort of depends on what temperature you store it at and how active your yeast was. But Anyway, so that's it.
What would be a good general rule of thumb? Leave it in your cabinet or in your pantry for a week.
You want
try one.
Yeah,
see if it's right.
That's typically what I do. I put it in somewhere room temperature is at least 70 degrees. It should be in the dark as much as possible. Beer is spoiled by light. And after a week, I'll start trying them. And sometimes the first one I try is very flat, so I know not to try one again for another week. But usually somewhere within that like 10-day to 2-week period, the bottles are ready. And some beers will get better in the bottle over months or years. Other beers are best fresh. So you think about your hop-oriented beers like IPA or a subtle Pilsner like we've made, those are better fresh. One other thing, Mickey, that you can do as a home brewer that I've just started doing, but it saves some time and energy, which is kegging your beer instead of bottling it. And this requires, chest freezer or kegerator setup, an investment in a little bit more hardware like a CO2 tank and a regulator. This regulator supplies 2 kegs, so that's usually what I am able to keep full in my garage kegerator. But that ends up saving you a lot of time and energy in bottling and sanitizing and cleaning bottles. But it's also nice to have a 6-pack of bottles homebrew to take to your community picnic or whatever.
Yeah, you can take a keg to your friend's house, but it's a little harder.
It's a little harder, yeah. So there's pluses and minuses in both ways of dealing with it. All along the way are the points that I crack a fresh homebrew if I have them. Amazingly, this time we managed to find a lull in the keg supply and the bottle supply in my garage, which is shameful, but we do have plenty of cans of good local beer. So
that is okay. It
yeah.
has been quite an ordeal for the entire planet, and even though you had time at home instead of at the office,
I've been doing
you were dealing with homeschooling and everything else in the world like everybody else. So I totally understand.
That's right. Well.
So one other thing you mentioned, it's not a good idea to recycle bottle caps. What's a good place to source bottle caps? Do you get that at your local?
Yeah, that's a local homebrew shop kind of thing. They're very inexpensive, a few cents a piece, but you really can't save them and reuse them after they've been, can't pop.
They're too deformed to get the tool.
Exactly.
How much is a tool like that one going to cost?
This is very cheap. I'd say less than $10. It comes with most homebrew equipment kits. So common one that you can buy is like 2 buckets, a capper, a stirring spoon, maybe a hydrometer, some tubing, and a racking cane for like $75 or $100. But yeah, this tool also homebrew supply, say $10, maybe $15. I don't know for sure, but it's kind of essential. It's a funny little. It's got a magnet in there and a crimper, and it's designed just for that one thing. And it doesn't always work perfectly, but there's not any other tool I know of that can crimp a bottle cap on. However, if you do have, and I like these bottles better, as I said, you don't need that tool. You just need to keep your bottles clean and sanitized and your O-rings fresh. And
keep those oiled.
Yeah.
Keep them from cracking. And they look nice, and you can use them for so many other things too. I see people putting, making their own
vinegars,
garlic, olive oil, or whatever they're doing.
Yep, very useful.
Yeah, they look nice too.
If you like doing things for yourself, and also building community around creating things to eat and drink, then homebrewing is a great hobby to take up. So
and all your friends will love you if you share.
That's right. Yep.
That's it for this one. Really appreciate John having us over to his house.
Thanks for stopping by, Mickey. It's great to be on your channel. I love homebrewing, and I love your company, and I love the journey you're on. So it's a pleasure to have y'all into my garage. Hope it's been entertaining and maybe informative, and I've had a good time.
I hope you guys have learned something. Hope that you'll give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, and come back again soon. And don't forget, happiness is the new wealth.